people who bring that up may be melodramatic or something like that. Others think they have an idea of what we're talking about, but they say, well, this is up to the individual to decide. This is not something for philosophy to decide. If philosophy talks about sort of universally human things, or it's, even if it's a universally human issue, then it might be something for religion and not for philosophy. So there's a lot of attitudes like this. In any case, the attitude is it's either not worth talking about, or in academic philosophy, it's not necessarily worth giving serious philosophical treatment. Seems to be the overarching or the predominant attitude, in my experience anyway. There are some, there's exceptions to what I'm saying here. This is a generalization. There are some people who work on this, but it's few and far between. And in my opinion, the people who are talking about it aren't really getting at the issue that I would be concerned about if I were asking this question. So, it's worth asking, why is this? I think there are many reasons for this. I'm not going to try to touch on all of them, but I think ultimately we have these responses to this question of the meaning of life. We think there's some allergy to it. There's some impetus to reject it or devalue it or something like that, delegitimate it. And I think this has to do ultimately with the presuppositions that are being made by those people, their understandings of what's being asked by the question to render it unintelligible or not worth asking or not worth treating seriously in philosophical discussion. And maybe those presuppositions aren't well enough examined. And that might be fine for most people, but in philosophy, it's sort of our thing that we examine our thinking. I'd like to think. So we can't leave these presuppositions unexamined. We can't just reject that this is not, we can't hold that this is not a philosophical question until we've sort of done the work of thinking about what is meaning, how does it fit into our greater understanding of human existence, or how doesn't it fit, and why or why not. I think there's a few there's a few general common interpretations of this question that I think lead people to reject it. You might have an overly, this is more of an academic perspective, but you might have an overly narrow conception of what meaning can be. Like it only applies when we're talking about linguistic meaning, like the meaning of a word. So it doesn't really make sense to attribute that to life in general. Maybe. So you might reject it on sort of grammatical or logical grounds. Less academic, you might have this perspective, and I think this is why some people think it's sort of pretentious to talk about, but they interpret meaning as value, first off. So when you're asking about the meaning of human life, you would be asking about the value or worth of human life, some people think. And so that would be pretentious in a way, because you'd be sort of presuming to know, as if looking down on humanity from a God's eye view, if you will, being able to judge this is the worth of a human life, which we can't really do that. We can't get out of our human condition and so on. So that would be a pretentious question, but I don't think that's what you have to ask. If I'm thinking of this from the perspective of someone who claims to have experienced that a sense of meaninglessness in their life, or what we might call an existential crisis, if you're okay swallowing that term, without sort of associating that with melodramatic teenagers or something like that, as people often do, which I think is also a symptom of this issue. I don't think we have to judge, we don't have to interpret the question that way. Another way you might interpret the question is we're talking about purpose. The purpose of human life. And you might think, well, either that is fixed by something like religion, where God decides what human purposes are, or if not that, then it's up to the individual, because who else would have the authority to determine what my personal purpose in life is in life? Because people are interpreting purpose as well as sort of a project. What's my overarching project my life should be devoted to, something like that. I don't think we have to interpret meaning in that sense either, or rather I think we can, but there are more fundamental senses of meaning than either purpose or value or these other senses you can come to. So if we talk about those things and we reject the question on this basis, we're not really getting to the heart of the matter. So I want to think about, okay, what could someone who is genuinely, earnestly saying, I'm experiencing meaninglessness, I'm experiencing an existential crisis. Of course, we don't have to take seriously everyone who says that necessarily, because maybe they're not genuinely having a real loss of meaning. Maybe something else is going on, but it's at least possible, I want to say, that there is such a thing as a genuine existential crisis or a genuine experience of meaninglessness, in the sense that this is a question that any human being should be confronted with just by being human. And so it's not sort of an idiosyncratic issue for some people. It's not a something we could write off as, say, psychopathology or something like that. It's something that each of us has to take a stance on this issue, one way or the other, however implicitly. What is the meaning, or what meaning is there to my life, or to human life in general, really, is what we're talking about. So, okay. I'll skip ahead through some things here. But basically, I think that it's because of these prejudices, these sort of preconceived notions of what's being asked, and the preconceived notions of the human being and what human existence is like that underlies them, that's sort of ruling out in advance that this is a legitimate or intelligible question. And I think we need to dig a little deeper and examine these presuppositions. Now, okay, I've said all that. I want to ask the question of the meaning of human existence. How do we do that? Well, I think what we need to do is we need to try to find a more fundamental sense than these senses I've talked about, like value and purpose. We need to find a sense of meaning that could plausibly apply to the human condition taken as a whole, because we're asking about the meaning of human existence, and something that somebody could plausibly be concerned about if they were saying, I'm experiencing meaninglessness, I'm suffering an existential crisis, etc. And so I want to look for sort of the most fundamental sense of meaning that I can, that explains these other uses of the term, but also kind of gets more to the core of the issue. And I want to do so with an account that keeps a view to its own presuppositions about human nature and all these other things that are operating in the background when we talk about some kind of formulation of the meaning question. And I think Heidegger does that. There are a number of advantages to his account, but maybe I'll just go ahead and get into it. So what is Heidegger's account? It's a long story of how I got to this conclusion, but I'll give you the conclusion first and then maybe back up and say how I got there. Heidegger understands meaning as horizon. The meaning of something is the horizon against which we can make it intelligible to ourselves. And by horizon, I do mean that in the sense of, say, the horizon, over which the sun rises in the morning and so on. Not obviously the same one, but that is an example of the kind of horizon we're talking about. It's a sort of limitation in the way that the horizon, the actual, the literal spatial horizon, draws a limit to what we can see spatially. So the horizon is sort of a productive limit which circumscribes our context of understanding. I'll unpack that. So think about how the horizon, or having a view to the horizon, the literal horizon, helps you understand your spatial environment and navigate it and orients you toward it. If you have a view to a horizon, a literal spatial horizon, you can distinguish on that basis up from down, left from right, near from far. if you do not have any sense, think of, being in a plane and the pilot loses sense of, it loses a view to the horizon in every sense. They would be disoriented. It's often a problem flying. They could crash because they get so disoriented in that situation. So think about how disorienting that would be to have no sense of the horizon. Basically, think of being in a void. You'd have no idea how, no sense of depth, no sense of dimensions in general. So you wouldn't really know your way about. You'd be disoriented. So in that way, in the way the spatial horizon orients us towards our spatial environment, the horizon of anything is sort of the basis on which further distinctions can be made, which allow us to sort of orient ourselves in a given space, whether it's a conceptual space, if you will, or a literal space. I'll give examples, but essentially we can think of meaning as the horizon, the context or background, which serves as the immediate condition for the possibility of something's intelligibility, if you want to get technical about it. Or I like to say it's the fundamental distinction on which other orienting significant distinctions can be made. So that was a little more technical than I wanted to get, so let me back up. So I gave the example more concretely of spatial horizon. How does this work? The spatial horizon is a point of reference, is what I want to say, basically. It's a point of reference that helps me orient myself towards my spatial environment. So what's the sort of background context or point of reference that gives me orientation toward human life as a whole? Heidegger wants to talk about meaning in this basic sense across many contexts. He says, we can talk about meaning, and actually Dr. McGee touched on this concept a little bit last time when he talked about context, the context of something, the surroundings of something help you make it intelligible. This is an idea that Heidegger uses. It's only with reference to the surrounding spatial environment that I can make, say, the chair intelligible, and so on and so forth. So it works on that level, but it also works on the level of the whole of human existence. Now, I don't expect everyone to be familiar with Heidegger here, but he has a phenomenological account of anxiety, phenomenological account in the sense that it's an analysis of first-person experience to look at the sort of structures of possible experience in so doing. So he gives you the account of, here's what it is to be in the mood of anxiety, or Angst in the German, like existential Angst. And this is a very important account for him. He thinks that this is a special mood, anxiety, in the sense, or Angst, in the sense that when we're in it, all familiarity with the world around us, all significance drains away from our world. The world looks to us completely alien, unfamiliar, strange, peculiar. And at the same time, in so doing, realizing this, we realized that we were projecting meaning on the world all along, if you will, and that we are responsible for doing so. So this mood gives us a sort of special insight into the structure of human understanding, the nature of human understanding. But in this mode, he says, we experience the world as meaningless, or rather we experience ourselves, our existence, as meaningless. And we are in the mode of uncanniness, is the word he uses. That's Unheimlick in the German, which literally would translate unhomelike, not at home. We are not at home in the world, or we're experiencing ourselves basically as alienated from the world in this mode of anxiety. He thinks that this highlights something fundamental about us. But what we also see here is the sort of whole of human existence before us. And most of all, we see death. and he understands death a little differently from how we commonsensically do. It is not, he distinguishes demise. Demise would be sort of the, what we usually understand as death, like one day my body will stop working, etc. Or maybe you could think of, perishing. Or you can think, oh, I have this psychological readiness for my dying or something like that. This is not what he's talking about. He experiences, he thinks if we authentically, as he likes to say, experience death, we're experiencing it as a sort of limitation, a sort of limit possibility or a horizon, if you will, which, in light of which all our other existential possibilities are sort of light up. By existential possibilities, I mean our possible understandings of ourselves and our world. Heidegger has this notion that we're always interpreting our world, and we are always doing so through the lens of a certain self-understanding. So we always must have some self-understanding that we freely project upon the world, and we understand our world in terms of it. And that's what moods are, essentially. So in anxiety, we've been interpreting the world all along. We see the sort of limitations of our possibilities, and in that same motion, we see we're brought before this horizon or limit possibility of death, and it shows us, it orients us towards the other possibilities we have, the various ways we could understand ourselves, not necessarily explicitly, but in a sort of indeterminate way. And so we see basically in anxiety that we have been existentially free all along, and that we are existentially responsible. And that is, we must interpret ourselves one way or the other, but we have the freedom to do so in multiple possible ways. We could understand ourselves in different ways, and therefore we can understand our world in different ways. So, okay, what does all this have to do with meaning? So essentially, Heidegger would be saying death is the meaning of life, if you will, in the sense that death draws sort of the limitation, it sort of circumscribes human possibilities of freedom and self-understanding. It highlights our finitude, but in the same motion, it is a productive limitation because it allows us to understand our positive freedom to interpret ourselves one way or the other, and so take responsibility for it for the first time fully. And that's what it is to be authentic, he says, or to be resolute. You respond to what you encounter here in anxiety, this sort of meaninglessness, this strangeness of the world, and also your need to sort of freely interpret it. And if you respond appropriately, you don't just sort of wave it off and try to forget about it the next day. You will resolve yourself upon some possibility that you've chosen. Yes. That's correct. So if you're in anxiety, you're confronted with this horizon of death, and if you sort of appropriately respond to it, you will orient yourself toward your own freedom and your own possibilities, just in the same way that a spatial horizon allows you to orient yourself toward directionality, spatiality in the concrete spatial world. At least this is the metaphor I find useful. Yeah. Yes. So we can. Sorry. Yes. If people didn't hear that question, it was, does Heidegger therefore reject the notion that life is meaningless? Yes. So it's a little more complicated than that. He's willing to say he's talking about the sort of experience in which we would experience meaninglessness. But he doesn't conclude from this that therefore life is meaningless. It's rather that we give life meaning in a way by interpreting ourselves and life. There's still a challenge here. The challenge is, if you're interpreting yourself and your world accordingly, and you're responsible for projecting meaning, doesn't that lead to a sort of worry about arbitrariness? Like I could just project any meaning, I can understand myself anyway. Is that really going to give me a stable sense of meaning? If you were worried about losing a sense of meaning, you might be worried about that. He does have an answer to that question too. So ultimately, his answer is going to be, we are going to be able to secure meaning in a certain way, but we have to go through certain steps to get it. And I have more to say about that. But yeah, go ahead. What is anxiety? So it is this special mood. Good question. I should have clarified this. So yes, Heidegger is using anxiety in a different way than we use it. We use it commonsensically. When we use it, we're basically talking about fear or apprehension or something like that, especially something about something specific in the world. So I'm anxious about this test I have coming up, or something I think might happen. But he distinguishes anxiety from fear. Fear is about specific fears you could have about things in the world. Anxiety is not directed toward anything in particular. It is still a sort of dread or a sense of a threat in some way, in some general sense, but it is not toward any particular thing in the world. In fact, it's toward the entire human condition as a whole. The very sheer fact of my existence is the object of anxiety. So I won't, if I try to think, I might experience anxiety and I might have trouble. I might be asking myself, what am I so anxious about? If I'm understanding it on some level properly. But I wouldn't be able to find anything in particular. And it's also not that you don't have to, there's not necessarily an emotional element in the straightforward way that we would think of anxiety normally. I think the best concrete understanding of this I could give is, maybe you've had an experience like this. You sort of wake up in the middle of the night and you're in your bed and you're looking at your ceiling and you're looking around your room, and for some reason everything seems strange to you. What would normally be the most familiar place to you in the world, your bedroom, suddenly everything seems very strange, unfamiliar. And this is, I think, what he has in mind when he's talking about the sort of alienation that you experience, alienation from the world. In anxiety, the stripping away of all familiarity, you no longer understand the world as you did, in a sense. So it's different from what we normally think of as anxiety, and maybe using the German term Angst would be better, because we usually reserve that for sort of existential matters, whether we understand that very well or not. But yeah, so it's not quite fear, but there is nevertheless this sense of something threatening or alienating is what I'm confronting, and it's the human condition itself. It's the sheer fact of my existence and the fact that I must interpret the world in some way, because it has been stripped away of the significance and familiarity. I realized I was projecting that up to this point, and now that's withdrawn for a moment, and it's sort of laid bare that I've been doing this. So yes, this is anxiety. I could say more about it, but what I really want to highlight about it is that there's this uncanniness. Uncanniness is meant in the sense of estrangement, like there's something strange. Like when we say something is uncanny, we feel like something's off and we can't quite pinpoint what it is. I think that is something he wants to evoke here, but it's also that we are, in the sense that we're not at home. Not only is the familiarity stripped away, but we realize that there's sort of this barrier to be crossed or something to be confronted. Yeah, sorry. Actually, Camus said in Myth of Sisyphus that he was inspired by Heidegger. Like this is, he thinks that Heidegger got anxiety right, and this is sort of the basis for the sort of the fundamental experience of the absurd that he's talking about. I mean, he takes it in a different direction. He reaches different conclusions than Heidegger does, because Camus ultimately wants to have this sort of self-consistent nihilism in a way. Like, yes, there's no meaning, but we don't have to feel bad about it, essentially. But Heidegger is going to say, well, we can recover a sense of meaning, so we don't have to stop at this problematic state. But at least if we confront the problematic state and realize that it exists, then we can do something about it. Which Heidegger thinks most of the time, if we have some experience like this, we just try to put it out of our mind and go back to our familiar daily life the next day and think, oh, I had some kind of weird psychological episode, but it's not anything deeper, right? We don't have a vocabulary for talking about it other than like the psychological, maybe. Yeah. Yes, just now. Yeah. Yeah, yes. Yes, it's a difficult concept because he thinks death is nothing definite. We usually think of death in a way to be this definite event that happens. It's coming in the future and it will eventually happen and then that will be it. But he thinks of death, he thinks that is an understanding of death, but it's derivative of a more fundamental understanding. And that understanding is that death is something indefinite. It not only could happen at any moment, it's not even truly an event, but it's really this sort of sheer existential possibility or something that you primarily would confront in anxiety in this very indefinite way, like this, the sense of dread or uncanniness that comes there is maybe connected to this. So he says we can orient ourselves towards this possibility in different ways. We could basically cover over, try to reject the possibility, say, well, death happens, but it doesn't happen to me. I see it happening to other people, but it's, never will it necessarily happen to me, or at least on some level, he thinks we think that. He thinks it's sort of, we sort of level down the importance of death. We don't think I have to face my death or something like that. He ultimately thinks death is something that's specifically my own. I have to face it. And insofar as I face it, so no one can stand in for me. I can't outrun this. And it always experiences this sort of indefiniteness, this sort of, I would say dread, because you can experience it in other moods than that. But it's this sort of facing that I will one day, quote unquote, have to give up my existence in the sense of my existential freedom to interpret things one way or the other. Right now, I go on interpreting, I go on thinking, I go on being, relating to my world in different ways. But death is sort of the negation of that in a strange way. Not logical negation, but a sort of sensed, exterior to that, if you will, that to the extent that this is a positive phenomenon, my relating to my world and interpreting it, there's the possibility, he calls it the possibility of the impossibility of existence. I confront that I may have to give up this sort of existential freedom in some way. And it's a sort of very indefinite sort of thing. It's not, I can fear my sort of physical death, but I can only have anxiety in the authentic way towards the authentic understanding of death. This indefinite limit possibility, just sort of outlines my finitude in general. He's kind of vague about it, and that's maybe why I'm being a little vague about it, but yes, go ahead. Mhm. So that sort of psychological coming to cope with it is, he says we can do that and still never authentically confront death, because he's talking about sort of the existential possibility of death, if you will, which underlines even our ability to, go through these stages of coping. So he does talk about that in Being and Time. Like, you might think we're talking about physical death, you might think we're talking about psychological coping with death, but that's not, he sets those aside. He says, the only way we could do these things is if we first have this sort of existential relationship with death. That is, we're always in some way relating ourselves to this sort of indefinite possibility, this possibility of the negation, if you will, of our existing. So it's not even something that we psychologically cope with or not. It's that we either live by resolving ourselves on a certain self-understanding, which is the appropriate, authentic response to death, or we sort of brush it under the table and just go back to our everyday ways of thinking and don't worry too much about it. So yes, his discussion is difficult to get our heads around too, because he wants to impress upon us, this is not an event like we could cope with, because if you're psychologically coping, you say, this is going to happen, this event is going to happen to me, and I'm going to psychologically prepare myself for it. He thinks just to treat death as an event is even not quite understanding it. It's something I should be able to experience at every moment, my dying, he likes to say. And it's not that I have to have that in my mind all the time, like I'm going to die one day, I need to cope with it. It's not that. It's that by realizing I need to, I am free to interpret myself in any number of ways, existentially speaking, and I must do so, and I can resolve myself upon doing so because I'm finite, because there's a limit to my freedom. I must choose one possibility or other at any given moment of how to understand myself and therefore interpret my world, live my life. Because I must choose, I am finite. And in confronting that finitude is confronting death for him in the authentic sense, even though that seems maybe strange to us because he's no longer talking about the event of demise or something like that. But it's really a confrontation with finitude itself, the limits of our freedom. Yeah. Other questions before I I know Heidegger's a lot to take in all at once. But what I really want to, whether or not you sort of pick up the details of Heidegger's account, I just want to drive home that he's thinking of meaning in terms of a horizon here. If you think of the role that death is playing for him as this productive limitation, this, draw a circle around, or horizon around human possibilities, say this is where humanity ends, if you will. This is where, what it means to be a human being, or the possibilities of being a human being, this is where they end, that's death. If you have a view to that horizon, then you have a sense of, okay, these are my possibilities, so I will be able to responsibly choose between them. Whereas before, I may not have been able to make my possibilities intelligible myself, the full scope of my freedom and responsibility to interpret myself intelligible to myself. But if you have a view to death, you can do that. So he thinks this is what authenticity is, the correct way to sort of understand ourselves, if you will. If you orient yourself, if you be towards death, as he likes to say, in the right way, then you will kind of keep a self-critical eye on the fact that you have this existential freedom to interpret yourself in many different ways. And therefore, there's this importance and need to choose, and choose responsibly. As opposed to, he thinks most people who are in everyday thinking, we don't think of ourselves as existentially free. We think of ourselves as having a sort of set essence or something like that, or at least a pre-understood sense of ourselves that doesn't get upset. So, there's a way that things just are, and my interpretation is not necessarily a factor. And, I go about my life within the bounds of what most people commonsensically think is what a human being does or is. But if we realize we have the freedom to upset that whole system, sort of redraw, if you will, the boundaries of how we understand ourselves and our world, then we have to take responsibility for that, and that's a weighty responsibility. Okay, so we're thinking of meaning as this horizon. Whether or not we don't have to agree with Heidegger that death is that necessarily. Maybe we can think of another answer. But the point is, the horizon of meaning as horizon, you can think of it as sort of the primary distinction. what determines the distinction ultimately between what is human and what is not human, you could say. What delimits human possibilities as human possibilities? What kind of beings are we? And therefore, what is possible for us? And therefore, what is the space to choose what we should do, and so on and so forth, what our purposes are. That's all derivative of first understanding what is the horizon in light of which we can understand ourselves as human beings. What are the possibilities for us? And therefore, from there, we can choose. This will be our purpose, but only then can we sort of responsibly choose. So in this way, meaning as horizon is more fundamental as a sense of meaning than purpose or value. Those things presuppose a sense of meaning as horizon. To say that you have a purpose, for example, this implies a sort of directionality, if you will, a sense of direction, a sense of my projects. I must, move in this direction, do this. I've ordered my world in such a way that this is important and this is not, and so on and so forth. But to have that sense of direction in your life, directionality implies some sort of orientation towards a space. Got some kickback there from Zoom, it sounds like. So in order to be able to responsibly select a purpose, you need to sort of know what are the possibilities for a human being, among purposes to select for them. Therefore, what kind of being am I? And so a horizon sort of circumscribes, draws the productive limit around our possibilities as this is what's human. This is what we will understand as human. These are the possibilities that I can select among in order to be human, if you will. And therefore, here are the possible purposes for a human being comes later. Here's what a human being can possibly value, and so on and so forth. So in this sense, I'm thinking Heidegger's onto something and taking horizon to be sort of a more fundamental sense of meaning than these other ways we usually talk about it. As this point of reference, this context that gives us orientation, this is what I have in mind. So, and it should hold for the whole of human existence, yes. So insofar as having meaning is having orientation with a view to a horizon, I'd say that experiencing meaninglessness has this aspect of disorientation. You don't have this sense of the distinction, if you will, between human and non-human. Now, this isn't necessarily explicitly how you would be thinking of it when you have this this experience of meaninglessness. But as Heidegger describes, say, anxiety, which would be the experience of meaninglessness, it's sort of significance is drained, which means my ability to sort of distinguish the aspects of myself and my world are in some sense dimmed down and harder for me to see and harder for me to orient myself towards. And there's this sense of, Sartre like to talk about nausea and things like this, but maybe this sense of I've lost my orientation towards what I'm even doing, what sense the different aspects of my life made, how do they cohere together? There's maybe a tension I'm experiencing there, and so on. And so a sort of disorientation comes with that. Also an alienation in the sense of, one could say, and this brings me to the talk of, why did I name my my dissertation The Homely and the Foreign? Heidegger talks about the homely, or being at home in the world, or passing through the foreign, or not being at home in the world. And this is a way of talking about meaning. And I think by having this vocabulary, I think this is useful because it taps into the aspect of alienation that comes with a sense of meaninglessness, and the relationship also with familiarity and a sense of belonging, if you will, with meaning. So this is an anecdote, so don't take this as hard evidence or anything, but I had a friend or a colleague some time ago who worked for a suicide hotline. And he said the number one thing that people said to him over the phone when they were contemplating suicide was, I feel like I don't belong in the world. I feel like the world doesn't want me in it, something like that. This is how they chose to express this sort of disorientation, alienation, sense of meaninglessness, essentially. And I think there's something to that. There's something that we don't quite capture if we limit our discourse to talking about purposes, projects you could do, because if you have no sense of orientation towards human possibilities at all, you will ask, why does any purpose that I could come up with matter, right? Why, so if you get to that sort of seriously, basically suicidal nihilism or sense of meaninglessness in a low moment. So I want to sort of speak to something that would actually address the concerns those people have and not write them off too quickly. So I think talking about meaning in terms of how can we be at home in the world, as Heidegger likes to talk about, and how do we experience meaninglessness? Meaninglessness is a sense of alienation or not belonging in the world or not being at home in the world. I think this adds a dimension to the discussion that was previously lacking. And maybe I can get a little more into that. So in his earlier work, Being in Time, mainly, Heidegger talks about, he does connect meaning to this sense of not being at home, as I mentioned earlier, this uncanniness. But he says human beings are essentially uncanny. We are essentially not at home in our world. It is an unavoidable aspect of our existence that we are somehow alienated from, in some sense, our world. So you might ask, okay, well, if we are, and this comes maybe as together with the fact that we transcend our world in some ways. We are always distinguishing ourselves from our world in order just to be, self-conscious beings. We have already distinguished ourselves from everything else, individually, but also in the sense of what is human and what is not human. In some sense, Heidegger thinks. Because we're always doing this, we're always, did I lose my sound? Okay, we're always doing this. What's the sense in which we could ever securely be at home in the world? You can also think this is a repetition of the problem of the arbitrariness of interpretation. We always have to interpret ourselves some way. We're free to do so in different ways. Isn't it arbitrary how we would do that? Can we ever permanently have a sense of meaning, given that it seems like we could always have it upset again by, crashing back into anxiety, having to confront, oh, this was my interpretation all along. Actually, you might think there's no meaning. That's not how Heidegger thinks of it exactly, but we could always experience this new episode of meaninglessness for whatever reason. We become disoriented for some reason. There's a lot of things that could trigger that, perhaps. But Heidegger wants to say, okay, we are essentially uncanny. We are essentially alienated from our world in some sense. We are not at home. And this is part of what we are. So how can that kind of being who is primordially, as he likes to say, or essentially uncanny, not at home, how can they be at home in a way that would entail securing meaning? And he has an answer to this. Well, it depends on a certain understanding of ourselves. And of course, it's going to be what he thinks is the authentic understanding. We have to resolve ourselves upon a certain possibility in the right way towards death. We have to keep a view to death in the right way, which means keeping a view to our existential freedom and responsibility. So in other words, he's saying we have to think of ourselves as what I like to call existentially creative beings. That is, we have to think of ourselves as the kind of beings who change themselves and their world through their thinking about themselves and their world. And this is how he thinks we do things. We choose a certain way of interpreting ourselves, not necessarily consciously. And we interpret our world in terms of that, sort of through the lens of that self-understanding. So any given self-understanding, you will have the world appearing a different way to you. And the authentic way to be is to understand yourself in just this authentic way. Like, I am this kind of being that can interpret myself in different ways, as opposed to, any other specific, more essentialist understanding I might have of myself. A scientific understanding or a what have you, just some everyday understanding, etc. So if we understand ourselves as these existentially free, existentially responsible, as I like to say, so we're able to choose different ways of thinking of ourselves, which will shape us and our world. We must do so. We have no choice but to interpret ourselves some way or other. We are finite in that way, right? If we're confronting our finitude. I like to sum all that up by saying he thinks we have to think of ourselves as existentially creative beings, or in his later work, he will say poetical beings. Poetical, he's using that in the etymological sense of, poesis means to create. So we are creative beings. That is, we are interpretive beings. So if we think of ourselves that way, he thinks that will be the most meaningful, that is the most orienting way of thinking of ourselves with regard to our existence. We can make the most sense of everything. We can make the most sense of ourselves. We can make the most sense of our world. And he thinks this will also lead to having an experience of a more significant world, in the sense that every self-understanding is concomitant with a understanding of the world. If I understand myself as sort of self-critically aware of my freedom to interpret, I will concretely experience the world in those terms. That is, you can think of it as everything is not locked to one particular interpretation of it, but it's sort of flickering indeterminately between different possible interpretations of it. So you can think of it as what is mysterious. If you think of just any given thing in the world, what is mysterious about it will sort of come to the fore in this way of seeing things. It's sort of, rather than our everyday understanding, which treats the world as thoroughly pre-understood, thoroughly sort of so familiar, it's boring, because we believe we, understand it so well. This poetical dwelling, as he likes to say, or what understanding of ourselves as poetical beings, is sort of recovering the mystery of beings as we sort of recover this sort of dynamic creativity in ourselves. Yes, there's a question.
We have a question from someone in our Zoom audience. Please go ahead.
Okay, so I wanted to, so far what I understood is that in order to balance out the primordiality of not belonging to this world and having meaning behind it depends on how we interpret ourselves and therefore the world. But isn't this like based on the assumption that our interpretation of the world is a reflection of our self-image and not the other way around? And are there other competing philosophies or other competing ideas by other philosophers that sort of give a contrast to this idea?
A contrast to the idea of that we understand our world in terms of ourselves?
Yeah.
Well, Heidegger thinks that most people do not think this way. This is sort of a broadly, you could say, existentialist way of thinking. That is, and even not everyone who calls themselves existentialists necessarily thinks exactly in this way, but an existentialist way of thinking, I mean, we affect the kind of beings we are by our different ways of interpreting ourselves. That'd be sort of a broadly existentialist way of thinking. But as far as, and people like Sartre sort of try to co-opt some ideas from Heidegger. I don't think he takes up Heidegger's whole sort of understanding as filtering through the lens of self-understanding quite in the same way. But Heidegger thinks, and any non-existentialist thinker would say, maybe our self-interpretation doesn't matter necessarily, or maybe it only matters in very limited ways. It's not that the whole world is determined in some way, how it shows up to us by our self-understanding. So I think Heidegger takes himself to be sort of an outlier here in the history of philosophy, but I'm not sure if I'm getting at your concern or not.
Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I do want to highlight that even though I think Heidegger's view is compelling, we can sort of abstract away from it if we just want to think about how to resuscitate this question of meaning. And I think, thinking of meaning in terms of horizon and also adopting this vocabulary, or maybe, exploring at least this vocabulary of home and belonging as meaning, and alienation and not belonging as meaninglessness. I think this can sort of give us a new way into the dialogue about meaning, whether or not we ultimately want to, take up Heidegger's precise view. Nevertheless, I think we can extract away from that and say, we can think about meaning in terms of horizon in some sense. It's just that Heidegger adds an additional element that in some ways simplifies the question, because to talk about meaning in a horizon, this always presupposes a certain understanding of the human being, not necessarily Heidegger's, just some understanding. Heidegger fills that presupposition in himself by saying the human being is like such and such. It's Dasein, as he likes to say. He has a very particular conception of what human existence is like, and therefore how a horizon could show up to us and enter into our intelligibility and make our world meaningful concretely, and so on and so forth. But if we took a step back from Heidegger's view, we could still talk about meaning as horizon, but then we would need to fill in what is the conception of the human being we're approaching this question from, such that we can talk about meaning as horizon, or can we still, depending on where we're starting from. So Heidegger starts out by saying, look, if you're going to follow along with my project, you have to buy in, at least for the sake of argument, to thinking of the human being in these terms, that is basically as an existentially free, existentially creative being, and then everything else will make sense from there. I invite you in so you can see whether your life seems more intelligible once you sort of are in this conceptual space. But we could have picked up a different starting point, right? But I think, at least to begin with, to give an example of how we can formulate the question intelligibly, Heidegger's view at least has that advantage that he can formulate it intelligibly, and he can be aware of, he can recognize his own presuppositions about, that he is thinking human nature is a certain way, and it's in light of that we can talk about meaning. Unlike other views which might reject the question of meaning without ever examining how they're thinking about human nature in the background that would lead them to that conclusion in the first place. So it's more self-critical, it's more self-consistent, Heidegger's view. But that's not to say his is the only view that could be like that. It's just that this is a model for how generally it could work. It has certain advantages like that. And I think, and I wanted to give this example to sort of try to resuscitate or reignite discourse on the question of meaning, just to prove it could be done. It could be made intelligible, this question. It could be answered. And Heidegger even also provides us a useful vocabulary to gain insight into different dimensions of it than we were exploring before, this home versus homelessness issue that brings in this element of alienation that we may not have talked about before. Maybe it was too abstract before. A lot of people might experience meaninglessness first and foremost in terms of alienation from other people, like the breakdown of their meaningful relationships. And this can sort of be what sets off a greater sort of trauma or disorientation towards the world. And so by bringing in that there's also this sort of ethical dimension, for lack of a better term, this sort of explores it from a new angle that I think is productive and can give rise to more discourse on the issue other than what we have now, which is, I think, not a lot. I think I might have missed a hand somewhere. Okay, maybe not. So, and since I've mentioned the ethical, probably there's some people on Zoom who are talking about Heidegger and the ethical, that's weird. I mean, they're probably thinking more articulate thoughts than what I just said, but Heidegger sort of is known for having an issue that, well, whether it's an issue or not, he wouldn't think it's an issue, for barely talking about ethics at all. Even though he uses terms like authenticity, and these seems like sort of value-laden terms, but he never articulated an ethics. People famously sort of criticized him for that, or asked him about it at least. And he seems to often talk as though he can reduce ethical issues to ontological issues, that is just issues about what is being, what kind of beings are we, and so on and so forth. So he talks about how to be authentic and even things like how to belong in the world, but he doesn't say you should try to belong in the world. You should try to make your existence as intelligible to yourself as possible, and my understanding of human existence has advantages for that. He doesn't say those things. So I'm kind of reading between the lines here as far as if we were interested in that, Heidegger can be advantageous. I think, he has a sort of self-consistency issue when it comes to that, because he himself acknowledges that any sort of interpretation of any philosophical question, whether it's the question of the meaning of human existence or even just what is human nature like, any interpretation presupposes a sense of what is significant. It presupposes certain interpretive selections. This is significant, this is not significant, therefore the interpretation comes about. So that implies, I think, a sort of normativity, or at least value, for lack of a better word, discourse, about how should we interpret ourselves. Shouldn't we be able to say something like, you should want to ask the question of meaning because you should want to make yourself, your life as a whole, as intelligible as possible. And maybe you could go further with sort of an ethical concern and say, we should want to understand human nature and our existence generally in the same way, so that we can, practically speaking, live in the same world, live according to a similar horizon, share a horizon, share an understanding of human nature, and therefore sort of creatively build this world in common, as someone inspired by Heidegger might say. Heidegger says none of that, at least not explicitly. So I think by bringing in this dimension of home and alienation and belonging, we also, if we're being self-consistent, have to bring in this ethical concern. We should be concerned to ask the question of meaning. At the very least, for these people who experience this sort of, or claim to experience this sort of suicidal nihilism, this sort of existential crisis experience, this loss of meaning, as they like to say, and maybe they don't understand how to articulate it themselves, but I think we owe it to these people not to just dismiss them outright as sort of psychologically defective or just being melodramatic or something like that, immature, pretentious, any of these things that you could think of. So in that way, I'm maybe parting ways a little bit or distancing myself from Heidegger. But I think, Heidegger still has resources to get us most of the way to where we're going as far as understanding the question of meaning ethically, in ethical terms as well. But I feel like I'm rambling here. So are there questions or thoughts? I know I'm kind of going in many directions here, but do you think this is a useful way of talking about the question of meaning, or is this we're still not going to talk about it at the end of the day? Like, this is too abstract, or it's too, it doesn't capture what we're really thinking when we think about of life? Yeah. Good. So, he thinks most of the time we're not in anxiety or anything like this. It's kind of an exceptional state. We start out in sort of everyday understanding where we're in our familiar world and we don't have any alienation from it. We know our way around. We are oriented in some sense. Maybe it's a limited sense in the grand scheme of things, but it is good enough for us to, find our way about in our day-to-day lives. But, he thinks essentially it's always possible for us to experience this anxiety, the angst. And once we're in this state, if you will, there are proper and improper ways to confront it, to respond to it. He thinks most of the time when people experience this or something derivative of it, they will sort of write it off, brush it under the rug. Like I said earlier, maybe they'll say, oh, I had some kind of strange depressive episode or something like that, but then there's nothing wrong. I don't know what, I was worried about. I'll just forget about it. I'll say, he even says in Being in Time, they'll say it was nothing. And they'll go about their daily life, somebody who experiences this. But the alternative is you can properly confront it. That is, realize what this is showing you, realize that this experience is giving you some insight into the human condition in a way, because it's making you confront the fact that you are an existentially free being in some way. You have this finitude, and that is in some way disturbing. But with that finitude, with that limitation of freedom and limitation of intelligibility, there sort of comes this productivity, insofar as this is a horizon, a limit possibility. Again, it's a productive limitation. We have finitude, but it's finitude that highlights what is positively possible for us. And if we sort of embrace that in a very concrete way, we have to realize what's being shown to us here. We have to realize, okay, from here on, I will not lose sight of what I've been shown here, if you will, what I've confronted here. I will somehow very concretely, not necessarily very consciously and theoretically, but very concretely, I will live my life with a view to, a self-critical view to this freedom I have. Realize that my interpretations are interpretations, that I have a role in understanding my world, and I have a responsibility for it. And so I will take responsibility. I will realize, okay, I am interpreting the world such and such a way. This comes from understanding myself in a certain way, and so on and so forth. And I will either resolve myself upon that, or I will attempt to recover my freedom to interpret otherwise, and so on and so forth. So just keeping a view to the very fact that I am this existentially free being. And again, and this is in a very concrete way, not in a necessarily theoretical way, even though I'm talking about it as though it were something that I'm consciously keeping in my mind at all times. There's actually, this is a way of being, this is a way of living. That's why it's an existential possibility. Even though I keep using the word to think, we could say, this is a way of relating to your world in general. If you relate to your world as a poetical being, this existentially creative being, and see your world, therefore, in this light, this will give you sort of a concretely significant world, and it will sort of secure meaning for you because you've resolved yourself upon thinking of yourself this way, as opposed to any other possible interpretation of yourself as something maybe more essentialist, some fixed nature that you have. You won't think that, you'll think my nature is due to my interpretation, or it is just, my nature is just to, he likes to say the essence of Dasein is existence, by which he means existence in the etymological sense, like standing out or standing towards. So we take stances towards ourselves and our world. And so our essence is just to do that, to interpret our world one way or another. So if we embrace that, then we will be authentic. Yes, there's a question.
Because
Oh. Yes, so please, I've basically said what there's to say other than questions, so let's do it. Sorry? Oh, sorry. Dr. Metz, would you please ask your question over Zoom? Our sound equipment isn't working other than mine, I think.
Right. Yeah, I couldn't hear anything. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. I can see you.
Okay. Yeah, so my question was about, I mean, I think you touched on this, I think, a bit earlier. One way in which it seems to me, something that I think about when I think about life being meaningless, or possibly the idea of meaninglessness, is kind of implied by this kind of picture that we're given by modern science, right? So a modern conception of physics kind of implies a kind of hard determinism, right? And hard determinism excludes free will. And that makes it seem like life can be meaningless because, we don't have any choice. Our motives are simply determined by, our prior histories, psychological and physiological histories. And then it seemed to me that Heidegger's way of thinking about meaning, you use this notion of being existentially free. So is Heidegger
Out there?
Kind of presupposing that we just have free will, so just excluding this as a notion of meaninglessness?
Sorry, you kind of cut out there for a few seconds, so I kind of lost track of your question partway through. So
Do you want me to say it again?
Just the last part, last few.
Yeah. So the point was just, it's that hard to, one might have this idea of, kind of hard determinism, or I think the hard determinism is somehow plausible, and that kind of implies a lack of meaning in life, right? Because it excludes free will. And then the thought, you mentioned this idea of being existentially free, which is obviously important to Heidegger. But then that just seems to kind of exclude this notion of meaninglessness. So, is that the way that we're supposed to understand Heidegger? He has to presuppose the freedom of will in order to get this notion of meaning going. And if so, why?
Good question. So Heidegger distinguishes between freedom of will, as we usually think of it, and existential freedom. He thinks freedom of will, as we usually talk about it, is a derivative mode or sense of freedom. The sort of more fundamental sense of freedom is existential freedom. But you can think of it like this: we are existentially free to even think of ourselves according to a scientific conception, or which would lead to this hard determinist picture in the first place, or we're free to interpret ourselves otherwise. So we have a way of getting out of that. But so he's not necessarily presupposing that we have this more traditional, like, metaphysical sense of radical free will or something like that. But this existential freedom, the freedom to interpret ourselves one way or the other, which could come with also a conception of freedom of the will, or maybe not in some sense. As far as that particular case of the scientific, especially hard determinist way of thinking of ourselves, I do think Heidegger can talk about that, and I think he is very much concerned about this sort of thing. He thinks more and more in the modern world, we're thinking of ourselves in basically, as science says we are, basically sophisticated machines that are subject to causal laws and so on and so forth. So we have to ask about whether that is how we should interpret ourselves. I think putting things in the language I've been using of disorientation, which is not necessarily how Heidegger say. He would say, a scientifically understood world is an unhomelike world, a world in which we can't seem to belong, because maybe I would say it's not orienting in the sense that we have these different elements that seem significant to us of our existence, of what we're calling freedom, and culture and value and all these things that don't quite seem to fit into the scientific picture if you take it very seriously, versus how science is telling us that we are. So to the extent that these things can't be brought into coherence, and it seems like there's a serious challenge to that, you could even think it manifests as like the hard problem of a consciousness, as we like to talk about it, and so on and so forth. There's a sort of disconnect between the first person view of ourselves and the third person view of ourselves, or however you like to say it. I think that sort of tension that we can experience is, or can give rise to, the sort of disorientation that we would experience as meaninglessness for Heidegger. So definitely he's thinking the world interpreted in terms of, in modern scientific terms, or as he likes to say, technological terms, this is going to lead to nihilism. So he thinks we need to recover our sense of interpretive freedom here, as opposed to getting caught up in this particular interpretation of ourselves, where we are not just lacking freedom of will in the traditional sense, but we're also not existentially free. That's really where the danger is for him, is the idea that the scientific understanding presents itself as capital T truth, if you will, about, it presents itself as having the authority to determine this is what a human being is. And if we take that as the only possibility, the only possible way of interpreting ourselves, then we are sort of understanding ourselves in a basically essentialist way, and basically objectifying ourselves as sort of not existentially free. And this is going to lead to nihilism inevitably, he thinks. So there's multiple levels, I suppose, of which that view can invoke nihilism from Heidegger's perspective. So he definitely does intend his view to capture that sort of approach to, having this sense of meaningless be evoked by an understanding, like a view to the scientific worldview. He does want to account for that. So whether or not I've been expressing myself clearly about how he would handle that, he does think that's, just one way, and in fact, a pretty prominent way that we will come to confront this sense of meaninglessness or disorientation if we try to think of ourselves purely scientifically.
Yeah, good. No, thanks. That's helpful to make the distinction between existential freedom and then this other kind of more fundamental sense of freedom.
Yeah, it's in the question concerning technology. Actually, he specifically deals with just these these issues and this what's surrounding it. So and he puts it a lot more eloquently than I. Yeah.
All right. Thanks.
There's other questions on Zoom. Okay. Next question on Zoom.
Oh, I wanted to just sort of follow up on Yuan's comment, or basically just the conversation you just had with him. So I think that Heidegger sort of really hit the nail on the head, but only by giving like a generalizable abstraction of how everyone actually finds meaning. And I think that religions are like a more specific example of this abstraction. So I don't really understand how, I don't understand why would Heidegger's perspective like allow for nihilism or encourage it in any way. Maybe I misunderstood Yuan's question in that case.
Oh, so I think first off, Heidegger's not encouraging nihilism. He's trying to get us out of the threat of nihilism, which he thinks is a serious threat to the modern age. Like we are sliding just culturally into nihilism. He's very inspired by Nietzsche in that regard. But I think Dr. Metz was saying it's a certain way that we might come to the concern about the meaning or meaninglessness of our lives in light of, this modern scientific worldview that many of us, we're all familiar with by now. If we interpret ourselves just as science, the picture science seems to paint of us that we are basically sophisticated machines or biological, organisms only in this very limited material sense. We're subject to causal laws, et cetera, et cetera. Doesn't that invite nihilism, or couldn't that evoke meaninglessness after a fashion? And then the question is, how do we explain that in Heidegger's terms? That's what I took to be roughly Dr. Metz's question.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Okay, but as far as the question about religion, I think Heidegger would think that what religion gives us is a particular religion gives us a particular interpretation of the human condition. It gives us, here's what human nature is. Here is the human being's relationships to the divine, to nature, to all aspects. It gives us a whole interpretive schema. So that is, in a way, an attempt to make meaning, right? Religion is speaking to this. From Heidegger's perspective, we can talk about it in those terms. Maybe it's God that is the meaning of human existence rather than death, right? But if we do this, at least authentically, he thinks we have to remain self-critical as well to our interpretation. So we have to always, we can take up a particular interpretation and resolve ourselves upon it, but we have to keep open in some way the possibilities of other interpretations, even in a sort of indirect sort of way, in order to keep alive, our acknowledgement of our freedom, our interpretive freedom. So as long as we're doing that, we can raise the questions, is it really death that's the meaning? Isn't it, as someone like Levinas would have, the other? Is it God? Is it time? As you could also interpret Heidegger saying, is, we can have this, but it's always, this discourse would always say, it would operate in terms of what is the horizon in terms of which we orient ourselves towards human existence as a whole, the different elements of our existence. So I think that's how talk of religion might fit in, broadly speaking.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry, I'm being told. Okay. Okay, so for those of you on Zoom who might not have heard, apparently we're out of time. Thank you all so much for coming. If you have more questions, please feel free to email them to me or to the Philosophy Student Association. And we're going to call it here. Thank you everyone for attending. I appreciate your time. And I'm sure I'll see you around campus and so on. So take care. Thank you, everyone.